The call came through at 11:30 p.m. on a Friday night while I was shoulder deep in server racks at Manhattan Trust Bank, trying to stop a coordinated cyber attack that had already hit 3 of our biggest community banking clients. My secure phone buzzed against my tactical vest. I ignored it. Then it buzzed again. I pulled off my work gloves and checked the screen. Bradley Hoffman, my supervisor at CyberGuard Solutions, calling from his condo in Soho at what should be date night with whatever 20-something he was seeing this week. I almost didn't answer. When you're managing a security breach that's costing $85,000 per hour across 3 community banks that serve farmers and small businesses across upstate New York, phone calls from corporate feel about as urgent as a mosquito bite. But I answered anyway, because 26 years of military discipline and reliable crisis management conditions you to respond when command calls. Garrison here. Bull, it's Brad. I need to inform you of a company decision. Effective immediately, we no longer require your services as Senior System Security Architect. Your employment is terminated as of today. I looked at the mainframe console in front of me. Alert status. CR critical breach active. Database intrusion attempts showing 1,247 failed login attempts in the last 15 minutes. 3 separate community banking systems completely locked down due to our emergency protocols. Patricia Valdez, Manhattan Trust's operations manager, standing 10 feet away, looking at me with the kind of desperation you see on a forward operating base when the comms go down and enemy contact is imminent. Copy that, I said, keeping my voice level. I'll inform Patricia that you'll be handling the breach response procedures for the crisis I'm currently managing. Silence long enough that I thought the connection might have dropped. In the background, I could hear what sounded like expensive restaurant noise and someone laughing. What crisis? The coordinated cyber attack that brought me to Manhattan at 6 p.m. yesterday? 3 community banks are in full lockdown. The breach is costing approximately $85,000 per hour in frozen transactions and compliance violations. I'm in the middle of tracing the intrusion through legacy mainframe protocols that support farming operations and small business loans across the region. I assume you'll want to send someone else to complete the trace work since I no longer work for CyberGuard. More silence. This time I could hear him breathing in what sounded like a wine glass being set down hard on a table. Bull, let's discuss this after you've resolved the Manhattan situation. I don't think that's appropriate, sir. You just terminated my employment. I shouldn't be working on CyberGuard projects if I'm no longer a CyberGuard employee. I'll brief Patricia on what I've discovered so far and catch the next train back to Jersey. Wait, Bull, let me call you back. He ended the call before I could respond. My name is Michael Garrison. Everyone calls me Bull. That was my call sign back when I was handling satellite communications for the Air Force. I'm 51 years old, and I just got fired while managing a cybersecurity crisis that nobody else at my company knows how to solve. At 51, I thought I had maybe 14 good working years left before thinking about retirement and maybe some consulting work. I thought I'd built enough reputation and expertise to coast into my golden years with respect, and the kind of security that comes from being the guy everyone calls when things go sideways. That phone call changed everything. Before I explain what happened over the next 72 hours, let me establish who I am and why that phone call was the most expensive mistake Brad Hoffman ever made. I joined CyberGuard Solutions in 2006 after 8 years in the Air Force handling secure communication systems. The military taught me how complex networks function under pressure, how to troubleshoot system failures when lives depend on it, and how to maintain operational security when everyone's shooting at you. Those skills translated perfectly to financial cybersecurity, where the enemies are hackers instead of insurgents, but the mission is the same: protect critical infrastructure that keeps America running. Back in the service, I was part of a team that managed satellite communications for forward operating bases in Iraq and Afghanistan. We had responsibility for maintaining secure data links between field units and command centers, making sure intel flowed where it needed to go when it needed to get there. When you're handling communications for troops in contact, there's no room for system failures. People die when networks go down in combat zones. That experience shaped how I approach civilian cybersecurity work. Every bank I protect, every system I secure, I think about the real people depending on those networks. It's not just about protecting money, it's about protecting livelihoods, families, entire communities that depend on financial infrastructure most people never think about. My specialty became legacy banking systems, the old mainframe computers that process farm loans, small business financing, and community banking operations that nobody in Silicon Valley thinks about, but that keep rural America economically viable. When a small-town bank got hit by sophisticated attackers and their IT department couldn't trace the intrusion they called CyberGuard, CyberGuard sent me. Over 18 years, I'd responded to 340 plus security emergencies across the Northeast and Midwest. I'd traced ACE-Quill injection attacks on systems that processed crop insurance payments. I'd diagnosed privilege escalation exploits targeting dairy cooperative financing. I'd identified zero-day vulnerabilities in software that handled equipment loans for family farms that had been in operation for 4 generations. This wasn't just about protecting money. It was about protecting the financial backbone of communities where a failed harvest loan could shut down a family operation that employed half the town. When these systems go down, farmers can't get operating capital for spring planting. Small manufacturers can't process payroll. Families can't access their savings. Real people suffer real consequences. I'd worked through blizzards, hurricanes, and family holidays. I'd missed my son Tommy's high school graduation to fix a breach at a credit union in Vermont that processed maple syrup cooperative payments. I had spent my 48th birthday in a server room in Ohio debugging COBOL code while Linda Garrison celebrated alone at home. Again, that was the price of being reliable. When you gave your word, you kept it. When they had a crisis, you showed up. Military values applied to civilian work. Most importantly, I developed deep expertise in COBOL banking protocols that most of the financial industry still runs on, but that they stopped teaching in computer science programs about 15 years ago. Every small bank had unique implementations. Every system had custom modifications. Every security model had quirks that existed only in institutional memory and hands-on experience with how those systems behaved under attack. That knowledge was what made me valuable. That knowledge was also what Brad Hoffman had just eliminated from CyberGuard's crisis response capability at the worst possible moment. The Manhattan crisis had started 29 hours earlier. First National of Cooperstown, Manhattan Trust, and Hudson Valley Community Bank had all called CyberGuard's emergency hotline within 45 minutes of each other, reporting sophisticated intrusion attempts targeting their agricultural loan processing systems. All 3 banks use similar legacy mainframe architectures that handle financing for farming operations across New York State. All 3 were experiencing identical attack patterns. This was a coordinated attack targeting the financial infrastructure that keeps small-town America running. Someone with serious resources and deep technical knowledge was systematically probing systems that process everything from seed loans in spring to equipment financing during harvest season. I'd spent the previous day conducting remote diagnostics, but by Thursday evening it was clear this wasn't something that could be resolved from our office in Paramus. The attack pattern suggested someone with extensive knowledge of COBOL banking protocols was systematically probing for vulnerabilities in systems that most people assumed were too obsolete to be worth attacking. They were wrong. Old code isn't automatically secure code. It's just code that nobody remembers how to fix when it breaks. I took the train into Manhattan Friday morning, arriving at First National at 8 a.m. Patricia Valdez met me at the security entrance, looking like she'd been running on coffee and determination for 48 straight hours, which she probably had. "Bull, thank God you're here. We've been locked down for 30 hours. Federal regulators are demanding explanations, and our board is asking why we can't secure our own systems. Because this attack pattern targets vulnerabilities that require hands-on mainframe access to properly trace. I need to examine the COBOL transaction logs directly." She led me to the secure data center, 3 floors of humming mainframe computers that, when operational, processed thousands of farm loans, small business financing arrangements, and community banking transactions that kept rural communities economically viable. All silent now, all offline, all costing these banks approximately $28,000 per hour in frozen transactions that affected real people. Farmers who couldn't get operating loans for spring planting, small businesses that couldn't process payroll, equipment dealers who couldn't finance tractors, and combines that farmers needed for the upcoming season, families that couldn't access their savings accounts. This wasn't just about numbers on a corporate balance sheet. This was about the economic survival of communities where everyone knows everyone, where a bank closure doesn't just mean inconvenience, it means economic death for entire towns. This was why I got into this work. These weren't just computers. They were the financial nervous system of communities that most people in Manhattan never think about, but that grow the food and manufacture the products that keep America running. I spent 8 hours tracing the attack through system logs, identifying the specific COBOL subroutines the hackers were targeting, and mapping their intrusion methodology. This wasn't some script kiddie operation trying to steal credit card numbers. This was sophisticated, methodical, and expensive. Someone had invested serious money and time understanding exactly how these legacy systems worked and where their weak points were. The attack pattern reminded me of enemy reconnaissance back in Iraq, systematic probing to identify weak points before launching the main assault. These hackers weren't hitting random targets. They were specifically targeting the financial infrastructure that supports American agricultural communities, probably knowing that these smaller institutions had limited cybersecurity resources compared to the big Wall Street banks. By 4 p.m. Friday, I'd traced the vulnerability to a buffer overflow in SUBOL code that handled agricultural loan authorization. The same authorization protocols I'd helped design and implement back in 1998 when these systems were considered cutting-edge technology. I was one of only 2 people who understood how that authorization code functioned under stress. The irony wasn't lost on me. The code we wrote 26 years ago to help small-town banks serve their farming communities was now being exploited by sophisticated criminals who probably viewed rural America as easy targets. Back then, we never imagined hackers in 2024 would have the computing power and patience to probe for buffer overflows in COBOL subroutines that processed maybe 500 transactions per day in 1998 but now handled 50,000. Fixing it required patching 26-year-old COBOL modules, updating mainframe security protocols, and implementing new input validation routines that would prevent similar attacks without breaking existing loan processing systems. This wasn't like updating your smartphone. You couldn't just download a patch and restart. Every change had to be tested, validated, and implemented with surgical precision. One mistake could freeze these banks' operations for weeks, which would essentially shut down agricultural financing for half of upstate New York during critical planting season. I started the patchwork at 10:30 p.m. Friday. The server room was quiet except for the steady hum of cooling fans and the occasional click of hard drives accessing data. I'd done this kind of emergency work hundreds of times before, but never with the knowledge that my employer was about to eliminate me from their crisis response capability. By 11:30 p.m., I was halfway through updating the first set of security modules when Brad called to inform me I was fired. After Brad hung up, Patricia approached cautiously. You could see reality setting in. The only person who understood their systems had just been terminated by his employer while in the middle of saving their operations. In her world, community banks don't just close for the weekend. They serve farmers who need operating loans approved by Monday morning, small businesses that process payroll on specific schedules, families that depend on access to their accounts for basic living expenses. Bull, is everything all right? You look like someone just delivered bad news. I just got terminated by my employer while securing your banking systems. Her expression went from concern to horrified. These community banks don't just serve customers, they serve neighbors, friends, families that have banked there for generations. Every hour these systems stayed offline meant real people in small towns couldn't access the financial services they needed to keep their lives and businesses running. Terminated, but you're the only person who understands our protocols. What happens to our systems? That's an excellent question. CyberGuard will need to send someone else to complete the work. How long will that take? The other engineer who understands these COBOL protocols is Tony Ricci. He's in Denver managing a federal contract. CyberGuard might have to wait until he becomes available. How long? The desperation in her voice was unmistakable. Tony's federal engagement is scheduled for another 12 days, plus travel time. Patricia's face went white. I could see her doing the math. We can't wait 12 days. Every day offline costs us $680,000 in frozen transactions plus federal compliance penalties. 12 days would be over $8 million in losses, and more importantly, it would shut down agricultural financing for the entire region during spring planting season. Then I suggest you contact CyberGuard Corporate and explain the urgency. At 12:45 a.m., my phone rang. James Castellano, CyberGuard's Chief Operating Officer. James had been with the company for 16 years and understood exactly how critical my role was to financial crisis management. He was also smart enough to realize that Brad had just made a catastrophic error in judgment. Bull, I just got off the phone with Brad. There's been a misunderstanding about your employment status. We need you to complete the Manhattan engagement before we discuss any personnel matters. Brad was very clear. He said my employment was terminated effective immediately. That's not a misunderstanding, that's termination. I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. James understood the implications in a way that Brad obviously didn't. This wasn't just about one experienced employee. This was about CyberGuard's entire reputation in the community banking industry, and more importantly, it was about the financial infrastructure that keeps small-town America running. I understand this is confusing, but let's focus on resolving the banking crisis first. We can address your employment situation after you've secured the systems. I don't think that's appropriate. If I'm terminated, I shouldn't be working on CyberGuard projects. If I'm not terminated, then Brad needs to call me back and clarify that he made an error. This is a critical client situation. These banks are losing hundreds of thousands of dollars per hour, then you need to clarify my employment status first. Am I a CyberGuard employee or not? Long pause. I could hear James thinking through the implications. If he said I was still employed, he'd be contradicting Brad's termination and creating internal political problems. If he said I was terminated, he'd be admitting that CyberGuard had just eliminated their crisis response capability in the middle of their most expensive emergency. Back in my Air Force days, we had a saying, "You can't fix stupid, but you can make it expensive." Brad's decision was about to become very expensive. Bull, let me conference in Brad so we can resolve this together. I'd rather you didn't. Brad was clear about his decision. I'm respecting that decision by no longer working on CyberGuard projects. If the banks need assistance, they should contact CyberGuard's emergency response line and request another engineer. There is no other engineer available who understands these legacy systems. That's an unfortunate situation. But it's not my problem anymore since I'm no longer a CyberGuard employee. I ended the call. Patricia was standing nearby, having heard my side of the conversation. The weight of the situation was settling on her like body armor loaded with ceramic plates. At my age, I'd seen this look before. The moment when someone in management realizes they're completely dependent on something they don't understand and can't control. What should we do, Bull? You should contact CyberGuard and request emergency engineering support. Explain the urgency. They'll prioritize getting someone here as quickly as possible. But you're here now. You understand our systems. You were in the middle of fixing the vulnerability. Can't you just complete the work? I thought about that carefully. Back in the Air Force, you'd complete the mission regardless of interpersonal politics because people's lives depended on it. But I'd learned something important over 18 years in corporate America. Loyalty has to flow both ways. I'd given CyberGuard my best years, missed family events, worked holidays, built their reputation one crisis at a time. The moment it became convenient, they eliminated me like outdated equipment. Linda Garrison had been telling me for years that I was too valuable to let one company control my future. Her father had worked 30 years for a manufacturing company, only to get laid off 6 months before retirement when they moved operations to Mexico. Nobody looks out for you except you, she'd always said. These companies will use you up and throw you away the moment it saves them money. I was terminated 90 minutes ago. I can't ethically continue working on a project for a company that just fired me. What if we hired you directly? Not through CyberGuard, but as an independent consultant working for Manhattan Trust. Now that was interesting. I'd never seriously considered going independent, but at 51, maybe it was time to think about options beyond the corporate ladder. My military pension provided some base security, and Linda had always encouraged me to value my expertise more highly than any single employer did. That would create contractual complications. Your bank has security agreements with CyberGuard. Those agreements probably have exclusivity provisions preventing you from hiring outside consultants to work on CyberGuard design systems. She called Manhattan Trust's legal department, had a quick conversation involving urgent whispers and regulatory timelines, then looked at me with cautious optimism. Our legal team says the security agreement has exclusivity provisions for routine maintenance, but emergency patches can be conducted by any qualified consultant if CyberGuard cannot provide timely support. They're defining timely support as within 24 hours of request. That was the opening I needed, not just to solve this immediate crisis, but to test whether there was a future beyond corporate employment. At 51, I was too old to start over at another company, but maybe not too old to start working for myself. Patricia sent a formal email to CyberGuard's emergency response team, copying me, requesting immediate engineering support for the banking security breach, and noting that the previous engineer was no longer available to complete the patchwork. She marked it urgent and requested response within 4 hours. At 2:15 a.m., we received a response that told us everything we needed to know about how this was going to play out. We acknowledge your request for emergency engineering support. Our senior security architects are currently committed to other client emergencies. We are working to identify available resources and will provide an estimated response timeline within 12 hours. 12 hours. In corporate speak, that meant they had no idea how to solve this problem without me, but they weren't ready to admit it yet. James was probably spending his Saturday morning calling every contractor and consultant he could find, trying to locate someone who understood COBOL banking protocols well enough to not make the crisis worse. Patricia showed me the email with the kind of expression you see on someone's face when they realize their position is about to be overrun and headquarters isn't sending reinforcements. What does this mean? It means CyberGuard doesn't have anyone available to send. Tony is in Denver, and apparently nobody else at CyberGuard has the expertise to handle COBOL banking vulnerabilities. So we wait, unless you want to exercise your contract provision and hire an independent consultant. Are you available as an independent consultant? This was the moment. At 51, after 26 years of military and corporate life, I was being offered the chance to work for myself, to set my own rates, choose my own projects. Never again worry about some MBA deciding my expertise was too expensive. I could be. What would your rate structure look like? I thought about that carefully. Independent consulting rates for emergency cybersecurity work typically range from $200 to $500 per hour, depending on expertise level and urgency. I was at the top of the expertise scale, and this was definitely urgent. More importantly, I was the only person available who could solve this problem immediately. $350 per hour for emergency security work, minimum 24-hour engagement to ensure complete vulnerability patching and system validation. That's $8,400 total. Payment terms, 50% deposit before I resume work, remaining 50% upon successful system restoration. Patricia didn't even hesitate. When your bank is losing $28,000 per hour and faces federal penalties that could reach millions, $8,400 for a solution looks like the bargain of the century. Done. I'll have our CFO process the deposit immediately. At 3:30 a.m. Saturday morning, my phone chimed with a bank transfer notification. $4,200 had just been deposited into my personal checking account, more money than I'd ever received for a single day's work in my entire career. At 3:45 a.m., I resumed work on the COBOL security patches, but now I was working for myself. The difference between doing the same work as an independent consultant instead of a corporate employee is psychological as much as financial. Every line of code I wrote was billable. Every problem I solved was building my reputation instead of someone else's company. Every decision was mine to make based on technical merit rather than corporate politics. For the first time in 18 years, I wasn't just fixing someone else's crisis. I was building my own future. By 11 a.m. Saturday, I'd completed the vulnerability fixes across all 3 banking systems. The work went faster than expected because I wasn't dealing with approval processes or having to document every decision for managers who wouldn't understand the technical details anyway. By 2 p.m., I'd updated the security protocols and conducted full system testing. By 4 p.m., all 3 banks were back online with patched vulnerabilities and no transaction processing errors. Total lockdown time, 46 hours. Total losses, approximately $390 million. But the systems were secure, and the patches I'd implemented would prevent similar attacks in the future. More importantly, farmers across upstate New York could access operating loans for spring planting, and small businesses could process payroll without worrying about their banks failing. Equipment dealers could finance the tractors and combines that farming communities needed for the upcoming season. Patricia was monitoring the transaction displays as wire transfers began processing normally again. The relief on her face was unmistakable, not just because the crisis was over, but because her community bank could continue serving the families and businesses that had depended on them for generations. Bull, I cannot thank you enough. You saved us from a disaster that would have been catastrophic if we'd waited for CyberGuard to send another engineer. You're welcome. I'll prepare a technical report documenting the vulnerability, attack methodology, and patch procedures. You should share that with CyberGuard so they can update their security documentation. At 9:30 p.m. Saturday, I received a call from James Castellano. I was back home in Jersey, exhausted but satisfied. More than satisfied, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pride in work that was entirely mine. Bull, I understand you completed the banking security work as an independent consultant. We need to discuss your employment status. Brad's decision to terminate you was premature. We'd like to offer you reinstatement with full back pay and benefits. I appreciate that, but I'm declining. I'm now operating as an independent consultant. It's more lucrative, and I have better control over which projects I accept. What does that mean for CyberGuard? You're our most experienced legacy systems expert. It means CyberGuard will need to develop other engineers with similar expertise, or accept that your crisis response capability is significantly reduced. The truth was, at 51, I'd finally learned what my father never had the chance to. He worked 32 years for the same manufacturing company, believing that loyalty and hard work would guarantee security. When the company got bought out, they eliminated his pension and laid him off at 58. He spent his last 7 working years bouncing between temporary jobs, never again finding the security he'd thought he'd earned through decades of faithful service. When I told Linda Garrison what had happened, she just smiled and opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving for a special occasion. Finally, she said, I was wondering how long it would take you to figure out what I've been telling you for 15 years, which is what? That you were too good for them, that you were making other people rich off your expertise while worrying about whether they'd keep you around. Now you get to make yourself rich. She was right, as usual. Over the next 6 weeks, I received 18 emergency calls from banks and financial institutions experiencing security crises. Each call followed the same pattern. Sophisticated attack on legacy systems. CyberGuard couldn't respond quickly enough. Could I help as an independent consultant? I helped all 18 clients, total consulting revenue $168,000 for 6 weeks of work. That was more than I'd made in the previous 8 months at CyberGuard. By August, I was receiving calls from institutions that had never worked with CyberGuard, asking if I was available for security audits and ongoing vulnerability consulting. These weren't emergency calls. They were banks that wanted to prevent emergencies by having someone who understood their legacy systems before problems occurred. By October, I had 8 long-term consulting contracts with community banks who wanted guaranteed access to my expertise when they needed it. Combined retainer revenue, $22,000 monthly, approximately $264,000 annually, plus additional project fees. In December, CyberGuard formally offered me a consulting arrangement. $350 per hour for active security work, $4,000 monthly retainer for availability and consultation, 6-month contract renewable at my discretion. I accepted because it was guaranteed revenue, and CyberGuard still represented a reliable source of emergency work. Brad Hoffman lasted until March. The board terminated him after calculating that his decision to fire me during the Manhattan crisis had cost CyberGuard approximately $1.2 million in lost client contracts, emergency recovery costs, and consulting fees they were now paying me instead of employing me directly. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were now paying me more in 8 months than they'd paid me in 3 years as an employee. By late 2024, I was managing 12 long-term consulting relationships with financial institutions across the Northeast. Annual revenue was approaching $650,000. I was working approximately 60% of the hours I'd worked at CyberGuard while earning nearly 5 times my previous salary. More importantly, I was valued. When clients called me for security crises, they understood they were paying premium rates for premium expertise. Nobody questioned whether my approach was worth the investment, but the real change wasn't financial. It was psychological. For the first time in my career, I wasn't worried about layoffs, corporate restructuring, or some new MBA deciding I was too expensive. My security came from my expertise, not from someone else's decision about whether to keep me around. Linda and I started talking about things we'd never been able to plan before. Maybe retiring to that cabin in Vermont we'd always dreamed about. Maybe taking that trip to Ireland we'd been putting off for 20 years. Maybe helping Tommy Garrison with a down payment on his first house when he gets back from his deployment. At 51, I thought my career was winding down. Instead, it was just getting started. Here's what I learned from the experience. The most dangerous employee to fire isn't the one who complains about salary or threatens to quit. It's the one who's literally in the middle of solving a crisis that nobody else knows how to solve when you decide they're expendable. Because when you fire that person, you don't just lose their future contributions. You lose their ability to prevent the immediate disaster that's happening right now. And you discover that replacing specialized expertise during an emergency is impossible. Brad wanted to reduce headcount and eliminate what he saw as an expensive senior engineer. He got exactly what he wanted. I was eliminated. But my expertise wasn't eliminated. It just got a lot more expensive. Sometimes the best revenge isn't proving people wrong. It's letting them experience the full cost of being right about what they wanted. Listen, if you're over 50 and you've spent decades building expertise that your company takes for granted, you need to understand something. Your value isn't determined by what one employer is willing to pay you. It's determined by what the market will pay for what you know how to do. And sometimes the market values that knowledge a lot more than your boss ever did. Don't wait for someone else's mistake to teach you what you're really worth.